Little did they know, their night of condescending remarks was about to become a lesson they'd never forget. Captain Sarah Mitchell adjusted the collar of her simple black dress as she stood near the ornate marble entrance of the Whitmore estate in East Hampton. The evening breeze carried the salt scent of the Atlantic Ocean through the perfectly manicured gardens, mixing with the expensive perfumes and cologne of arriving guests. At 29, she had the lean, athletic build of someone who'd spent years in peak physical condition, though tonight she'd deliberately chosen understated makeup and pulled her auburn hair back in a modest ponytail. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. After 8 months working as a nanny for the prestigious Whitmore family, she'd learned that blending into the background was often the safest approach. The sprawling mansion buzzed with the annual Whitmore Foundation charity gala, an event that drew New York's elite to raise money for veterans organizations. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over guests wearing designer gowns and tailored tuxedos, their jewelry sparkling as they moved between the grand ballroom and the terrace overlooking the ocean. Sarah had been invited by her employer, Victoria Whitmore, though she suspected it was more out of obligation than genuine inclusion. The invitation had come with careful instructions about appropriate behavior and a not-so-subtle reminder about her position in the household hierarchy. "Sarah, darling, you look lovely," Victoria had said earlier while getting ready. Her reflection multiplied in the vanity mirrors of her walk-in closet that was larger than most people's apartments. Her tone carried that particular brand of wealthy condescension that Sarah had grown accustomed to over the months. "Just remember, you're here as our guest tonight, not as Emma's nanny. Try to enjoy yourself, but do keep an eye on things, won't you?" Sarah smiled politely and nodded, as she'd been trained to do during her months of employment. What Victoria didn't know, what none of them knew, was that before Sarah had become their nanny, she'd been Captain Sarah Mitchell, United States Marine Corps, leading reconnaissance missions in Fallujah and earning a Bronze Star for valor under fire. The citation in her apartment drawer spoke of extraordinary heroism while engaged in combat operations against enemy forces, but tonight she was just the hired help making sure the canapés were properly arranged. The transition from combat zones to changing diapers and organizing playdates had been jarring. One day she was coordinating tactical operations with a team of Marines. The next, she was negotiating bedtime stories with an 8-year-old who had more shoes than Sarah owned total possession. But the job paid well, surprisingly well, and gave her time to figure out her next steps in civilian life. The Whitmores were generous employers, even if they sometimes forgot she was a human being with her own thoughts and experience. Standing in the corner of the ballroom, Sarah observed the guests with the same systematic awareness that had kept her alive overseas. She automatically noted exit points, potential choke points, and the subtle power dynamics playing out among New York's social elite. 8-year-old Emma Whitmore was sleeping peacefully upstairs, the little girl having begged to stay up late for the party before eventually succumbing to exhaustion around 7 o'clock. Sarah had volunteered to check on her periodically throughout the evening, a responsibility that seemed to reinforce her status as the help in the eyes of the other guests. She didn't mind, really, after surviving IED explosions, sniper fire, and the constant tension of combat patrols. Dealing with entitled socialites seemed remarkably manageable. Their worst weapon was passive-aggressive comments and dismissive glances, hardly comparable to actual bullying. Some days she found their petty dramas almost amusing, grown adults having meltdowns over flower arrangements or seating charts, while she'd once watched Marines share their last water bottles in The irony wasn't lost on her that this charity gala was raising money for veteran programs while most of the attendees had probably never met an actual veteran. She'd overheard conversations where guests spoke about our brave heroes overseas, with the same detached sympathy they might reserve for discussing endangered species. They meant well, she supposed, but their understanding of military service seemed limited to Hollywood movies and carefully curated news segments. Sarah kept that observation to herself, along with most other thoughts she'd accumulated during her months working for one of New York's most prominent families. She'd become expert at the polite smile, the deferential nod, the art of being present but invisible. It was a different kind of camouflage than she'd worn in Iraq, but equally effective for survival in this particular environment. Tonight, like every other night, she would smile, stay quiet, and do her job. The guests would continue to see her as just another piece of the household staff, someone to be politely ignored or occasionally acknowledged with the kind of distant kindness wealthy people showed to well-trained pets. What they didn't realize was that beneath the modest dress and careful politeness was someone who'd led Marines through some of the most dangerous territory on Earth. But then again, Sarah reflected as she watched a woman complain loudly about the temperature of her champagne, maybe it was better that way. Some truths were too complicated for charity gala small talk. As the evening progressed, Sarah found herself gravitating toward the main ballroom where the formal program was about to begin. The massive space was a testament to old money elegance. Hand-painted frescoes adorned the 20-foot ceilings, while imported Italian marble floors reflected the light from 3 enormous crystal chandeliers. Fresh white orchids and roses arranged in towering displays filled the air with their delicate fragrance, competing with the designer perfumes of the 200 guests who had gathered for the evening's festivity. Sarah positioned herself near the back of the room, close to the service entrance where the catering staff moved efficiently in and out with silver trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. From this vantage point, she could observe the entire room while remaining relatively inconspicuous. It was a habit from her military days: always know your exits, always maintain situational awareness, always have a clear view of potential threats, though the only threats here were likely to be spilled wine on expensive dresses or social embarrassment from using the wrong fork. The guest list read like a who's who of Manhattan society. Sarah recognized faces from magazine covers and newspaper society pages: tech billionaires, real estate moguls, fashion designers, and old money families whose wealth stretched back generations. They moved through the room with the confident ease of people who had never questioned their place in the world, air-kissing acquaintances and discussing their latest acquisitions with practiced nonchalance. Victoria Whitmore glided through the crowd like a skilled diplomat, her silver Valentino gown shimmering under the chandeliers as she worked the room. At 52 she was still striking, with platinum blonde hair styled in an elegant chignon and the kind of bone structure that suggested good genetics and even better cosmetic surgeons. She paused at each cluster of guests, her laugh perfectly modulated, her smile never wavering. This was her element. She had been born into this world and had spent decades mastering its intricate social choreography. Sarah watched as Victoria approached a group of women near the piano, their voices carrying clearly across the marble floors, despite their attempts at discretion. These were the wives of hedge fund managers and pharmaceutical executives, women who spent their days managing household staff, planning charity events, and maintaining the complex social networks that kept their husbands' businesses thriving. "Victoria, darling, what a magnificent evening," gushed a woman with perfectly coiffed auburn hair and enough diamonds to fund a small country's defense budget. Sarah recognized her as Priscilla Ashworth, wife of a pharmaceutical CEO and notorious gossip. "The flowers are absolutely divine, and that pianist, is he from Juilliard?" "Thank you, Priscilla. We flew him in from Vienna actually," Victoria replied with practiced modesty. Charles thought it would be a nice touch for such an important cause. As the conversation continued, Sarah noticed how naturally the group excluded the catering staff moving around them, how they spoke over and around the servers as if they were invisible. It was a dynamic she'd observed repeatedly during her months with the Whitmores, the casual dismissal of anyone they perceived as belonging to a different social class. The irony struck her again, that these people were raising money for veterans, while completely overlooking the fact that many of those servers might themselves be veterans, working multiple jobs to make ends meet in an economy that hadn't quite figured out how to value military experience. The ballroom's acoustics were excellent, designed for musical performances and speeches, which meant that conversations carried further than people might expect. Sarah's trained ear caught fragments of discussions about vacation homes in Aspen, private school admissions for children, and complaints about staff shortages at their various properties. She found herself cataloging the information automatically, another holdover from her intelligence training, where every piece of information could potentially be valuable. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Near the ornate fireplace, A group of men in tuxedos discussed business deals with the casual air of people moving millions of dollars around like chess pieces, their wives clustered nearby, occasionally contributing to the conversation, but more often focused on the complex social calculations that governed events like these: who was wearing what designer, who had arrived with whom, and who might be having financial difficulties based on subtle changes in their usual extravagance. Sarah checked her watch, 8:30. Emma would be deep in sleep by now, surrounded by her collection of stuffed animals in her princess-themed bedroom that was larger than most studio apartments. The little girl was sweet, curious, and surprisingly down-to-earth considering her privileged upbringing. She was also the reason Sarah had taken this job in the first place, though that was another truth she kept carefully guarded. The crowd began settling into their assigned seats as the evening's program prepared to begin. Sarah remained standing near the back, technically a guest but understanding her place in the invisible hierarchy that governed these events. She would listen politely to the speeches about supporting veterans, watch the wealthy attendees write tax-deductible checks for causes they'd never truly understand, and continue playing her role as the grateful employee who knew her place. What none of them realized was that their quiet, unassuming nanny was taking mental notes of everything, not for any malicious purpose, but because old habits died hard. And sometimes, Sarah reflected as she watched the glittering crowd settle into their gilded chairs, those habits proved more useful than anyone might expect. As the lights dimmed and a spotlight illuminated the small stage at the front of the ballroom, Sarah's mind drifted to the real reason she was here, not just as Victoria's employee, but as someone with a deeply personal connection to the Whitmore family that went far beyond her job description. Hidden in her modest purse was a worn photograph, one that she'd carried through 3 tours of duty and kept close to her heart for the past 8 years. The photograph showed 2 little girls, both with bright smiles and auburn hair, sitting on a tire swing in the backyard of a modest suburban home. One was Sarah at age 7, gap-toothed and covered in dirt from a day of exploring. The other was her younger sister Emma, not Emma Whitmore but Emma Mitchell, who would have been 21 now if fate had been kinder. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, remembering the phone call that had changed everything. She'd been in Afghanistan, 3 months into her second deployment, when her commanding officer had called her into his tent with that look that every soldier dreaded: car accident, drunk driver, her parents and younger sister, gone in an instant on a rainy Tuesday evening in suburban Connecticut. She'd been granted emergency leave, but by the time she made it home, there had been only graves to visit and paperwork to sign. What she'd discovered in those dark weeks of funeral arrangements and estate settling had shocked her to her core. Her father, who she'd always known as Jack Mitchell, the hard-working insurance salesman who'd coached her Little League team and taught her how to change a tire, had been born Jackson Whitmore. He'd been the eldest son of the Whitmore dynasty, heir to a pharmaceutical fortune worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The story, pieced together from old letters and legal documents, was like something out of a novel. At 22, her father had fallen in love with a young teacher named Mary Catherine O'Brien, Sarah's mother. When the Whitmore patriarch had forbidden the relationship, deeming Mary unsuitable for their social standing, Jack had made a choice that had reverberated through decades. He'd walked away from his inheritance, changed his name, and built a quiet, middle-class life with the woman he loved. Sarah had grown up, never knowing about the Whitmore money, never suspecting that her grandfather was one of the most powerful men in New York. Her parents had created a world of Saturday morning pancakes, family camping trips and homework at the kitchen table, a world that felt infinitely richer than the opulent ballroom she now stood in, despite having cost a fraction of what some of these guests spent on a single handbag. But the cruelest twist had come when she'd learned the identity of the drunk driver who'd killed her family: Bradley Hartwell, a 24-year-old trust fund baby who'd been bar hopping in his Ferrari when he'd crossed the center line at 90 miles per hour. The same Bradley Hartwell who was currently standing near the champagne fountain, laughing loudly with a group of young socialites as if he hadn't destroyed an entire family 3 years ago. His father's connections and expensive lawyers had reduced his sentence to 18 months, of which he'd served 11 before being released for good behavior. Sarah's hands clenched involuntarily as she watched him raise his glass in a toast, his face flushed with alcohol and privilege. He'd never even apologized, never acknowledged what he'd taken from her. His family's public relations team had spun the incident as a tragic accident and a learning experience for a young man. The Hartwells had even made a small donation to a drunk driving awareness charity, as if money could somehow balance the scales of justice. 8-year-old Emma Whitmore, her cousin though the little girl didn't know it, was sleeping upstairs, blissfully unaware that the nanny who tucked her in each night was actually family. Sarah had taken the job not for money or convenience, but because Emma was the last connection she had to her lost sister's memory. The little girl had the same curious eyes, the same laugh, the same way of tilting her head when she was thinking hard about something. Victoria and Charles Whitmore had no idea who she really was. The background check had shown Sarah Mitchell, decorated veteran and exemplary employee. They'd never connected her to Jackson Mitchell, the black sheep son who'd been effectively erased from family history after his betrayal 30 years ago. The Whitmores had built their empire on pharmaceutical patents and careful social positioning, and they'd never bothered to keep track of their disowned relatives. Sarah watched Victoria work the room, charming donors and maintaining the family's reputation, and wondered what her employer would think if she knew that the woman she treated as hired help was actually her husband's niece. Would it change anything? Would Victoria suddenly develop maternal feelings for the niece she'd never acknowledged? Or would she simply find a way to make Sarah's existence even more invisible? Another inconvenient truth to be managed and contained. The irony was almost overwhelming. Here she was, surrounded by her biological family's wealth and influence, while the man who'd destroyed her chosen family walked free among the same social circles, protected by the very system that had once rejected her father for choosing love over money. Sarah had spent months learning Emma's schedule, attending school events as the nanny, and listening to Charles Whitmore's business calls, all while carrying the weight of knowing that this little girl was the closest thing to family she had left in the world. Tonight, as these people raised money for veterans, while dismissing her as just another member of the help, Sarah realized that some battles were worth fighting, not for recognition or revenge, but for truth and family and the memory of people who'd loved her unconditionally in a world that seemed to value everything except what truly mattered. Charles Whitmore stepped onto the small stage, his distinguished silver hair catching the spotlight as he approached the podium. At 55, he carried himself with the confident bearing of a man who'd built an empire from his family's pharmaceutical patents, expanding their influence far beyond what previous generations had achieved. His navy Armani tuxedo was perfectly tailored, and his smile had the practiced warmth of someone comfortable addressing crowds of influential people. "Ladies and gentlemen, friends and fellow patriots," Charles began, his voice carrying easily through the excellent acoustics of the ballroom. "Welcome to the 15th Annual Whitmore Foundation Gala, dedicated to supporting our nation's veterans as they transition back to civilian life." Polite applause rippled through the crowd as guests settled into their seats, crystal glasses chiming softly against jewelry and designer watches. Sarah remained standing near the back, observing both the speaker and the audience with the analytical eye that had served her well during intelligence briefings. She noticed how Charles commanded the room's attention, how his voice carried just the right mixture of gravitas and warmth to keep wealthy donors engaged. "Tonight, we're not just writing checks," Charles continued. "We're honoring the sacrifice of men and women who've given years of their lives to protect our freedom. Veterans who return home to face challenges that most of us can't imagine, finding employment, dealing with trauma, rebuilding relationships that have been strained by deployment." The irony of his words wasn't lost on Sarah. Here was her uncle, though he didn't know it, speaking eloquently about veteran struggles while employing an actual veteran as his nanny and treating her as essentially invisible. She wondered what he would think if he knew that the woman watching from the shadows had led Marines through some of the most dangerous territories in Iraq, or that she'd earned a Bronze Star for pulling wounded soldiers to safety under enemy fire. "The statistics are sobering," Charles went on, clicking to a presentation slide that showed veteran unemployment rates and suicide statistics. 22 veterans take their own lives every single day. Many struggle with PTSD, with finding careers that match their skills, with feeling valued in a society that often thanks them for their service, but doesn't always follow through with meaningful support. Sarah found herself nodding slightly, despite her complicated feelings about the speaker. The statistics were accurate, and Charles seemed genuinely passionate about the cause. She'd seen too many of her fellow Marines struggle with the transition to civilian life, brilliant tactical minds, reduced to asking, "Would you like fries with that?" Because employers couldn't see past their military experience to recognize their actual capabilities. In the audience, she observed the guests' reactions with professional interest. Most seemed appropriately moved by the presentation, though she noticed several people checking their phones discreetly, and one woman near the front appeared to be making shopping lists on her napkin. The wealthy had their own version of combat fatigue: too many charity galas, too many causes, too many requests for their financial support. Bradley Hartwell, she noticed with a surge of cold anger, was barely paying attention to the presentation. He was whispering with a blonde woman who kept giggling at whatever inappropriate comments he was making during a speech about veteran suicide. The sight of his casual disrespect made Sarah's jaw clench involuntarily. This was the man who'd killed her family, sitting in a room dedicated to honoring sacrifice, treating it like background noise for his social hour. "Our foundation has provided over $12 million in grants this year alone," Charles announced, generating another round of applause. "We've funded job training programs, mental health services, housing assistance, and educational scholarships, but there's so much more work to be done." Sarah had to admit that the Whitmore Foundation's work was impressive. She'd researched it thoroughly before taking the nanny position, partly to understand her potential employers, and partly to see if their charitable efforts were genuine or just tax write-offs for wealthy people's guilt. The foundation appeared to be legitimate, with solid financial transparency and meaningful partnerships with veteran service organizations. "Tonight, I want to share something personal with you," Charles said, his tone becoming more intimate. "Many of you know that the Whitmore family has a military tradition stretching back generations. What you might not know is that this cause became deeply personal to me when we lost my older brother Jackson along with his family in a tragic accident 3 years ago." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected this, hadn't known that Charles even acknowledged her father's existence, let alone his death. Around the room, guests murmured sympathetically, unaware that the brother's daughter was standing 20 feet away, watching her uncle memorialize a man he'd supposedly disowned decades ago. "Jackson served his country with honor before starting his own family," Charles continued, his voice carrying genuine emotion. "Though we'd lost touch over the years due to family disagreements, his death reminded me how precious these connections are, how important it is to honor those who serve and to value the time we have with the people we love." The presentation screen behind him showed a photograph that made Sarah's heart race. It was her father in his army dress uniform, young and proud, taken shortly after he'd completed basic training. She hadn't known the Whitmores had kept any photos of him, had assumed they'd erased all evidence of their disowned son. Sarah forced herself to breathe slowly, calling upon the emotional control that had kept her alive during combat operations. This was unexpected territory, an emotional ambush she hadn't prepared for. Around her, the crowd was moved by Charles's apparent vulnerability, but Sarah understood the deeper currents at play. This was her moment of calm before the storm she could sense approaching, a final peaceful interlude before the evening's careful social choreography began to unravel. Because she recognized something in the crowd's dynamic, a restlessness that suggested the formal presentation was ending, and the real socializing was about to begin. That's when people would start talking, start making assumptions, start treating her like the invisible help they assumed she was. What they didn't realize was that their quiet, observant nanny had been trained to handle far more dangerous situations than anything their social hierarchy could present. As Charles concluded his speech to another round of applause, the ballroom's energy shifted from formal attention to social circulation. The lights brightened slightly, and the carefully orchestrated mingling portion of the evening began. Sarah watched as groups reformed and conversations resumed, her military-trained senses picking up subtle changes in the room's dynamics that most civilians would never notice. The first warning sign came from her peripheral vision, a cluster of women near the champagne fountain who had been whispering throughout the presentation. Their body language had shifted during Charles's speech, becoming more animated and focused. Sarah recognized the telltale signs of gossip in motion, the way they leaned in closer, the quick glances they cast around the room to ensure they weren't being overheard, the excited energy that surrounded fresh social intelligence. Priscilla Ashworth was at the center of the group, her diamond earrings catching the light as she gestured emphatically. Sarah's enhanced hearing, trained through years of intelligence work where missing a whispered detail could mean the difference between life and death, picked up fragments of their conversation despite the general hum of the crowd. Noticed her during the speech, standing by herself, never seen her at any of the other events. Victoria introduced her as a guest, but Sarah's instincts, honed by countless dangerous situations where threats could emerge from seemingly peaceful environments, began sending warning signals. In Iraq, she'd learned to trust these subtle cues, the way conversations changed when outsiders approached, the shift in group dynamics that preceded trouble, the particular quality of attention that marked someone as a target. The second warning sign came from the catering staff. Sarah noticed how their movements had become more deliberate around her position near the service entrance. 2 servers lingered longer than necessary near her location, and she caught one of them glancing in her direction while speaking quietly to his colleague. Their behavior suggested they'd received instructions about her presence, perhaps to keep an eye on her, or to report her activities to someone. But it was the third warning sign that made Sarah's combat instincts fully activate. Bradley Hartwell had begun moving through the room with purpose, his earlier casual drinking replaced by a more focused energy. He was asking questions, gesturing toward her general area, and Sarah could see the predatory interest in his eyes that she recognized from patrol situations where insurgents were gathering intelligence before an attack. "Excuse me," she heard him say to a nearby server, his voice carrying just enough to reach her ears. "That woman over there, by the back wall, she's not with any of the usual crowd, is she?" The server, clearly uncomfortable with being drawn into guest politics, mumbled something non-committal and tried to move away, but Bradley persisted. "I'm just curious, because she looks familiar. Maybe she works for one of the families, a personal assistant or something." Sarah felt the familiar tightening in her chest that had always preceded contact with hostile forces. In Afghanistan, this feeling had saved her life more times than she could count. The subtle awareness that she was being stalked, that someone was gathering information about her position and vulnerabilities before making their move. The fourth warning sign came from Victoria herself. Sarah watched as her employer approached the gossiping women near the champagne fountain, her posture suggesting she was about to engage in the kind of social reconnaissance that wealthy women use to maintain their positions in the hierarchy. Victoria's smile was still in place, but Sarah could read the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers drummed against her clutch purse, signs that suggested she was either receiving or about to deliver information that would shift the evening's social dynamic. Sarah's training kicked in automatically. She began cataloging exit routes, noting which doors led to the garden, which hallways connected to the main entrance, and where potential choke points might occur if she needed to move quickly. The ballroom's layout, which she'd observed casually upon arrival, now became a tactical map in her mind. She also started assessing the people around her with military precision. Priscilla Ashworth, gossip coordinator, potential information warfare specialist, motivated by social status rather than genuine malice. Bradley Hartwell, direct threat, impaired judgment from alcohol, personal history of reckless behavior, potential for escalation. Victoria Whitmore, unknown factor, capable of either protection or betrayal depending on how she calculated the social costs. The fifth and most concerning warning sign came when Sarah noticed how the conversations in her immediate vicinity had begun to die down. It was subtle, the kind of thing that happened when a predator entered a watering hole and the other animals sensed danger. People weren't looking directly at her, but she could feel the weight of their attention, the way discussions shifted to lower volumes when speakers realized she might be within listening range. In combat, this was the moment when Sarah would radio for backup, check her weapons, and prepare for contact. Here, in a ballroom full of Manhattan's elite, her only weapons were her wits, her training, and her ability to maintain the composed facade that had gotten her this far. The final warning sign was almost imperceptible, a change in the room's acoustic quality that suggested people were positioning themselves differently, creating conversation clusters that had clearer sightlines to her location. Sarah recognized the pattern from hostile villages where insurgents would arrange themselves to observe and report on American patrols. She took a slow, controlled breath and straightened her shoulders slightly. Whatever was coming, she would be ready for it. The peaceful charity gala was about to become something else entirely, and Sarah Mitchell, former Marine captain, decorated veteran, and current nanny to the Whitmore family, would handle it with the same precision and professionalism that had carried her through 3 tours of duty. The only question was whether these privileged socialites had any idea what kind of storm they were about to unleash. The shift in the room's energy became unmistakable as Priscilla Ashworth detached herself from her gossip cluster and began moving across the ballroom with the calculated precision of a social predator who had identified her target. Her Louboutin heels clicked against the marble floor in a rhythm that reminded Sarah of incoming artillery rounds, steady, purposeful, and impossible to ignore. Behind her followed a small entourage of equally well-dressed women, their faces wearing the particular expression of wealthy socialites who had caught the scent of fresh scandal. Sarah watched their approach with the same detached professionalism she'd once used to observe insurgent movements through her rifle scope. Priscilla led the formation like a seasoned commander, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the chandelier light as she gestured to her companion. The woman had clearly done this before, identified someone who didn't belong in their carefully curated social ecosystem, and moved to either assimilate or eliminate the threat to their established order. "Well, hello there," Priscilla said, as she reached Sarah's position near the service entrance, her voice carrying that particular tone of false warmth that wealthy women used when they were about to deliver social warfare disguised as pleasantries. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced. I'm Priscilla Ashworth." She extended a perfectly manicured hand, her grip designed to communicate both her social status and her expectation that Sarah would recognize and defer to it. The other women arranged themselves in a semicircle around Sarah's position, a classic pincer movement that cut off potential escape routes while maintaining the appearance of casual conversation. "Sarah Mitchell," Sarah replied evenly, accepting the handshake with just enough pressure to suggest she wasn't intimidated but not enough to signal aggression. Her military training had included courses on diplomatic protocol, and she recognized this encounter as a form of social combat that required different tactics than battlefield engagement. "Sarah Mitchell," Priscilla repeated thoughtfully, as if testing how the name felt in her mouth. "And how do you know the Whitmores? Are you in pharmaceuticals, finance? I pride myself on knowing everyone in our little community, but I'm afraid I don't recall seeing you at any of our usual gatherings." The questioning had begun, each inquiry designed to probe for weaknesses and establish Sarah's position in their social hierarchy. Sarah recognized the interrogation techniques. They were surprisingly similar to what she'd used when questioning suspected insurgents, though considerably more polite in their delivery. "I work for the family," Sarah answered simply, choosing honesty over elaborate deception. She'd learned in combat that the best lies were always grounded in truth, and her current situation was complicated enough without adding unnecessary layers of fiction. "Oh, how wonderful!" exclaimed a tall brunette woman who'd been introduced earlier as Margot Pemberton, wife of a hedge fund manager. Her enthusiasm was clearly performative, the kind of exaggerated interest that wealthy people displayed when encountering someone they considered beneath their social station. "And what do you do for them? Are you in their corporate office, public relations perhaps?" Sarah could feel the weight of their collective attention, the way they leaned in slightly as they waited for her response. This was the moment where her cover story would either hold or begin to unravel, and she could sense that these women had already drawn their own conclusions about her role in the Whitmore household. "I'm Emma's nanny," Sarah said clearly, watching as the admission landed among the group like a perfectly placed tactical strike. The subtle shift in their expressions was immediate and telling, surprise giving way to a particular kind of satisfaction that came from having their suspicions confirmed. "The nanny," Priscilla repeated, her voice carrying just enough volume to ensure that nearby conversations would pick up the information. "Well, isn't that lovely? Victoria is so good to include her staff in these family events." The word staff hung in the air like the acrid smell of gunpowder after a firefight. Sarah recognized it as the first direct shot in what was clearly going to escalate into a more aggressive social engagement. These women had identified her as someone they could safely target without social consequences. After all, who was going to defend the hired help? "And you must be so grateful for the opportunity to see how these events are organized," added Margot, her tone dripping with the kind of condescension that suggested she genuinely believed she was being generous with her attention. "I imagine it's quite different from what you're used to." Behind the main group, Sarah noticed that Bradley Hartwell had begun drifting closer, drawn by the scent of developing drama like a shark following a blood trail. His face wore the expression of someone who sensed entertainment value in the unfolding situation, and Sarah could see him positioning himself to overhear what promised to be an increasingly uncomfortable conversation. "Tell me, dear," Priscilla continued, her voice taking on the particular cadence that wealthy women used when they were about to deliver what they considered a devastating social blow. "Have you been enjoying the presentation? I imagine all this talk about supporting our veterans must be quite inspiring for someone in your position." The pause before position was deliberate, designed to emphasize exactly where these women believed Sarah ranked in their social hierarchy. Sarah could feel her combat instincts responding to the verbal attack, the same way her body had once reacted to the whistle of incoming mortar rounds. "It was very informative," Sarah replied calmly, her voice carrying none of the anger or embarrassment that her interrogators clearly expected to provoke. Mr. Whitmore's statistics about veteran unemployment were particularly interesting. "Oh yes, Charles does his research," Priscilla agreed, though her tone suggested she was mildly disappointed that her verbal probe hadn't drawn blood. "Though I suppose for someone like you it's all rather academic, isn't it? I mean, you wouldn't really understand the complexities of these social issues." Sarah felt something cold and dangerous shift inside her chest, the same feeling she'd experienced when insurgents had made the fatal mistake of targeting her unit's medic during a humanitarian mission. These women had just crossed a line they didn't even know existed, and they were about to discover that their carefully constructed social hierarchy meant absolutely nothing to someone who'd earned her position through actual merit rather than inherited wealth. The evening's careful choreography was about to be disrupted by forces that Priscilla Ashworth and her privileged companions could never have anticipated. They thought they were dealing with a servant who would accept their condescension gracefully. They had no idea they'd just declared war on a decorated Marine combat veteran who'd survived far worse than anything their social weapons could deliver. The moment Sarah revealed her role as the nanny, she could practically feel the shift in power dynamics ripple through the small crowd that had gathered around her. What had started as curious social reconnaissance had transformed into something far more predatory, and Sarah found herself being evaluated with the cold calculation that wealthy socialites reserved for those they considered beneath their notice. Priscilla's eyes lit up with the particular gleam that came from discovering fresh ammunition for social warfare. She exchanged meaningful glances with her companions, a silent communication system that Sarah recognized from military operations where team members coordinated attacks without verbal commands. These women might wear designer gowns instead of combat gear, but they operated with the same pack mentality that Sarah had observed in hostile territories. "How absolutely fascinating," Priscilla said, her voice carrying just enough volume to attract the attention of nearby guests. "And here I was wondering who you might be. Victoria is so generous with her invitations, isn't she, including the household staff in family events." The deliberate emphasis on household staff was designed to establish Sarah's position in the social hierarchy for anyone within earshot. Sarah noticed how conversations at nearby tables had begun to quiet slightly, the way they did when people sensed developing drama but wanted to observe without appearing too obvious about their interests. Margot Pemberton stepped closer, her movement casual but clearly coordinated with Priscilla's verbal assault. "I must say you're quite fortunate to work for such a prominent family. The Whitmores have always been known for their charitable nature toward their employees." Sarah recognized the tactical positioning immediately. Margot was attempting to flank her conversationally while Priscilla maintained the frontal attack. A third woman, whom Sarah had mentally catalogued as the brunette with the Cartier watch, had positioned herself to cut off Sarah's line of retreat toward the service entrance. It was textbook small unit tactics, adapted for social combat. "The work must be fulfilling," added the third woman, whose name Sarah recalled as Vivian Blackwood. "Caring for other people's children, managing their domestic needs. Though I imagine it can be challenging to relate to a child from such a different background than your own." The subtext was clear. They were probing to understand exactly how far beneath them Sarah was positioned in the social order. Each question was designed to elicit information about her education, her family background, her financial status, intelligence gathering that would allow them to calibrate their attacks more precisely. Sarah maintained her neutral expression while her mind automatically began assessing her opponents with military precision. Priscilla, primary threat, experienced at social manipulation, likely to escalate if her initial attacks proved ineffective. Margot, opportunistic attacker, would follow Priscilla's lead but lacked independent initiative. Vivian, analytical type, gathering information for future use, potentially the most dangerous in a prolonged engagement. Emma is a wonderful child, Sarah replied evenly, choosing to deflect rather than engage directly with their probing questions. Very bright and curious about the world. Oh, I'm sure she is. Priscilla agreed with the kind of false enthusiasm that suggested she found Sarah's devotion to her employer's child either touching or pathetic. Children from privileged families often are. They have access to the best education, the finest experience. I imagine it must be quite an education for you as well, seeing how the other half lives. The comment was clearly designed to establish the vast gulf between Sarah's presumed background and the world she was temporarily allowed to inhabit as an employee. What these women didn't realize was that they were grossly miscalculating their target's actual position and capabilities. Bradley Hartwell had moved closer during the exchange, positioning himself near the champagne fountain where he could observe the developing situation while maintaining plausible deniability about his interest. Sarah could see him listening intently, his face showing the particular expression of someone who sensed entertainment value in watching what he assumed would be a one-sided social destruction. I notice you haven't mentioned your own background, Vivian observed with the precision of someone trained in extracting information. Where are you from originally? Did you attend university? I'm always curious about the educational paths that lead people to service positions. The pause before service positions was calculated to emphasize exactly how these women viewed her role. Sarah recognized it as an escalation in their verbal assault, moving from subtle condescension to more direct classification of her as domestic help. I studied at several institutions, Sarah answered truthfully, though she knew her interrogators would interpret her vague response as evidence of educational inadequacy rather than military intelligence training and advanced tactical coursework at some of the country's most elite military academies. Diverse, Priscilla said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I do admire people who take unconventional educational paths. Not everyone is cut out for the traditional route after all. Sarah could feel the weight of observation from other guests who had begun to notice the developing confrontation. Some appeared sympathetic to what they assumed was an uncomfortable situation for the obviously outmatched nanny, while others seemed to be settling in to watch what promised to be an entertaining social execution. What none of them realized was that they were watching a decorated combat veteran being systematically underestimated by opponents who had confused privilege with actual power. Sarah had faced down insurgents, navigated political complexities in war zones, and led Marines through life-or-death situations that would have reduced these socialites to tears. But for now she remained perfectly still and composed, allowing her opponents to reveal their tactics, their motivations, and their vulnerabilities. In combat she'd learned that the enemy often defeated themselves if you gave them enough rope to hang themselves with. These women were weaving that rope with every condescending comment, every assumption about her background, and every demonstration of their belief that social status trumped actual capability. They had no idea that their quiet, differential target was conducting her own assessment of their weaknesses, cataloging their pressure points, and preparing for the moment when their social warfare would demand a response that would shatter every assumption they'd made about who they were dealing with. The social dynamic had shifted noticeably as more guests became aware of the developing situation near the service entrance. Sarah could sense the change in the room's energy. Conversations at nearby tables had grown quieter, heads turned more frequently in their direction, and she could feel the weight of collective attention that came when Manhattan's elite sensed fresh entertainment at someone else's expense. Priscilla seemed to feed off the growing audience, her posture straightening as she recognized that her performance was being observed by their social peers. This wasn't just about putting an uppity servant in her place anymore. It had become an opportunity to demonstrate her own position in the hierarchy while providing amusing spectacle for the other guests. You know, Sarah, Priscilla began, her voice now carrying clearly across the immediate area. I was just telling Margot how refreshing it is to meet someone who's found their proper place in the world. There's something to be said for people who understand limitations and work within them. The word limitations hung in the air like a challenge, designed to provoke a response that would justify escalating the verbal assault. Sarah recognized the tactic immediately. It was similar to interrogation techniques she'd observed insurgents use when trying to break captured soldiers, probing for emotional triggers that could be exploited. After all, Margot chimed in, emboldened by Priscilla's increasing aggression, not everyone can be born into families with the resources for proper education, proper connections, proper opportunities. Some people have to find other ways to attach themselves to success. The implication was clear and deliberately insulting. They were suggesting that Sarah had somehow manipulated her way into the Whitmore household, that she was a social climber using her position to gain access to a world where she didn't belong. The accusation would have been devastating to someone who actually fit their assumptions about her background and motivation. Sarah maintained her composed expression, drawing on the same emotional control that had kept her alive during enhanced interrogation training. She'd been subjected to far more sophisticated psychological pressure than these amateur practitioners of social warfare could devise, and their clumsy attempts at manipulation seemed almost quaint compared to what she'd endured in military survival school. "I've always believed that honest work has its own dignity," Sarah replied calmly, her tone carrying none of the anger or embarrassment that her antagonists clearly expected to provoke. "Taking care of children is important work regardless of their family's social status." "Oh, absolutely," Vivian agreed with false enthusiasm, stepping closer as she prepared to deliver what was clearly intended as a more direct attack. "Though I do wonder if you fully appreciate the enormous responsibility that comes with caring for a child from such a prominent family. The Whitmores move in very exclusive circles, and Emma will need to be prepared for a level of sophistication that, well, let's just say it requires a certain type of guidance." The subtext was unmistakable. They were questioning Sarah's qualifications to influence a child who would grow up in their social sphere, suggesting that her presumed lower-class background made her unsuitable for even domestic employment in a wealthy household. Bradley Hartwell had moved close enough now that Sarah could smell the expensive bourbon on his breath. His eyes had the glassy quality that came from several hours of steady drinking, and she could see the cruel amusement on his face as he watched what he assumed was a helpless employee being systematically humiliated by her social superiors. "You know what I think?" Bradley interjected, his words slightly slurred but his intent unmistakably hostile. "I think some people get ideas above their station when they're exposed to wealth that isn't theirs. They start thinking they belong in places they don't, with people they have nothing in common with." Sarah felt a familiar cold sensation in her chest, the same feeling she'd experienced when insurgents had targeted civilians under her protection. Bradley's casual cruelty, combined with his history as the drunk driver who'd destroyed her family, made him a particularly dangerous variable in an already volatile situation. "Bradley, darling," Priscilla said with delighted approval. "What an astute observation. It must be so difficult for the help to maintain proper perspective when they're constantly surrounded by luxury they could never afford themselves." The circle of antagonists had tightened around Sarah's position, their body language becoming more aggressive as they sensed what they believed was a weakening target. Other guests had begun to gather at a respectful distance, drawn by the developing drama but maintaining enough space to claim they weren't actively participating in the harassment. "I imagine it must be particularly challenging," Margot added with mock sympathy, "when you're working for a family that's so generous with their staff. It might create unrealistic expectations about your actual place in their lives." Sarah recognized the escalation pattern immediately. These people were feeding off each other's aggression, each comment designed to be more insulting than the last as they competed to deliver the most devastating verbal blow. It was pack behavior similar to what she'd observed in hostile tribal groups where individual members tried to prove their status by demonstrating their willingness to attack perceived enemies. "Tell me, Sarah," Vivian said with the precision of someone moving in for what she believed would be a killing blow, "do you ever find yourself forgetting that you're just the hired help? Do you sometimes imagine that you're actually part of the family instead of someone who's paid to clean up after them?" The question was designed to be the ultimate humiliation, forcing Sarah to acknowledge her servant status in front of a crowd of people who would forever remember her as the pathetic employee who'd been put in her place at a charity gala. What these social warriors didn't realize was that they were about to discover the difference between targeting a genuinely vulnerable victim and provoking someone who'd been trained to respond to hostile interrogation with methods they could never imagine. Sarah's military training had included extensive preparation for psychological warfare, and she recognized that this situation had crossed the line from social awkwardness into active harassment. The time for passive endurance was rapidly approaching its end, and these privileged amateurs were about to learn that their assumptions about power, class, and vulnerability were catastrophically wrong. The verbal assault had reached a crescendo, but Sarah could sense that her antagonists were growing frustrated by her composed responses. In her experience, bullies escalated to physical intimidation when their psychological tactics failed to break their target, and she could see the signs of that transition beginning to manifest in their body language and positioning. Priscilla took a half step closer, moving into Sarah's personal space with the calculated aggression of someone who'd learned that physical proximity could be used as a weapon. The older woman's expensive perfume, something French and overwhelmingly floral, invaded Sarah's breathing space like a chemical attack designed to establish dominance through sensory assault. "You know, dear," Priscilla said, her voice dropping to a more intimate volume that forced anyone listening to lean in closer, "I think there might be some confusion about your role here tonight. This is a very exclusive event, with very carefully curated guest lists. Perhaps there was miscommunication about your invitation." The implication was clear. She was suggesting that Sarah had somehow manipulated or deceived her way into the gala, that her presence was inappropriate, and possibly unauthorized. Sarah could feel the shift in the crowd's energy as nearby guests picked up on the accusation, their expressions changing from casual interest to the kind of scandalized attention that accompanied social disaster. Bradley moved to Sarah's left flank, positioning himself close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his alcohol-flushed skin. His expensive tuxedo couldn't disguise the predatory gleam in his eyes or the way his hands moved restlessly at his sides, as if he was considering more direct forms of intimidation. "Maybe we should ask Victoria about this," Bradley suggested with mock helpfulness, his words carrying far enough for several nearby tables to overhear. "I'm sure she'd be very interested to know if her staff is overstepping boundaries." The threat was both subtle and devastating. By suggesting they would involve Victoria directly, Bradley was implying that Sarah's behavior tonight could cost her her job. For someone who actually depended on the Whitmores for their livelihood, the prospect of being publicly embarrassed in front of her employer would have been terrifying. Margot moved to Sarah's right, completing what Sarah recognized as a classic pincer movement, designed to make the target feel trapped and overwhelmed. The three women now formed a semicircle around her position, while Bradley blocked her most direct path toward the main ballroom. It was textbook crowd control, adapted for social warfare. "Oh, I don't think we need to bother Victoria with this," Vivian said with false magnanimity, stepping closer so that Sarah was now surrounded on all sides. "I'm sure we can resolve this little misunderstanding among ourselves." Sarah felt the familiar heightening of awareness that had served her well in hostile territories. Her peripheral vision sharpened, her hearing became more acute, and her mind automatically began calculating distances, angles, and potential responses to various escalation scenarios. The difference was that instead of armed insurgents, she was facing wealthy socialites who had no idea they were employing military tactics against someone far better trained in their application. Priscilla reached out and touched Sarah's arm, the contact ostensibly friendly but clearly intended as a dominance display. Her grip was firm enough to suggest ownership, the kind of casual physical contact that wealthy people used to demonstrate their right to treat service personnel as objects rather than individuals. "This dress," Priscilla said, fingering the fabric of Sarah's modest black evening gown, "it's quite lovely. Rental, I assume, or perhaps a generous hand-me-down from your employer. I do admire people who make the best of their circumstances." The physical examination was humiliating and invasive, designed to reinforce Sarah's status as someone whose clothing, appearance, and very presence could be scrutinized and judged by her social superiors. Sarah could feel the fabric of her dress being assessed like merchandise, her personal space violated with the casual entitlement that came from believing she had no right to protest such treatment. "The jewelry is interesting too," Margot added, leaning close enough to examine Sarah's simple pearl earrings, a gift from her mother that she wore to every important occasion. Costume jewelry can look quite convincing these days, can't? Though I suppose when you're working around the real thing all the time, you develop an appreciation for quality pieces. Bradley's contribution to the physical intimidation was more direct. He moved close enough that Sarah could feel his breath on her neck when he spoke, his proximity clearly intended to make her uncomfortable and emphasize her vulnerability in the current situation. "You know what I think the problem is," Bradley said, his voice low and menacing. "Some people don't understand boundaries. They get a little taste of the good life and suddenly think they deserve to be treated like equals instead of remembering their place." The crowd of observers had grown larger, forming a loose outer circle around the confrontation. Sarah could see faces she recognized from society pages and business magazines, all watching with the kind of fascinated attention that people reserved for traffic accidents and public humiliation. Some appeared uncomfortable with what they were witnessing, but none seemed inclined to intervene on behalf of someone they assumed was merely hired help. Sarah remained perfectly still as hands touched her clothing, as bodies pressed closer to her position, as voices whispered threats, disguised as concern. Her military training had included extensive preparation for exactly this type of psychological and physical pressure, hostile interrogation techniques, designed to break down resistance through incremental violations of personal space and dignity. What her antagonists didn't realize was that every inappropriate touch, every invasion of her personal space, every assumption about her helplessness was being catalogued and evaluated. Sarah had endured far worse treatment from actual enemies and had emerged victorious through superior training, discipline, and tactical thinking. These pampered socialites were about to discover that their casual cruelty had consequences they'd never imagined, and that their assumptions about power, privilege, and vulnerability were about to be dramatically corrected by someone who'd learned combat tactics in places where mistakes meant death rather than social embarrassment. The situation near the service entrance had begun to attract too much attention for Priscilla's comfort. While she enjoyed having an audience for her social dominance displays, she was experienced enough to recognize when a public confrontation might reflect poorly on her own reputation. The growing crowd of observers included several prominent society photographers and at least one gossip columnist, creating the potential for unwanted documentation of what could be spun as unseemly behavior toward an employee. "Perhaps," Priscilla announced with the air of someone making a magnanimous gesture, "we should continue this conversation somewhere more private. I wouldn't want to monopolize everyone's attention with what is, after all, a rather minor staffing issue." Her tone suggested that removing Sarah from the public eye was an act of kindness rather than a tactical maneuver designed to eliminate witnesses to whatever escalation she had planned. Sarah recognized the shift immediately. In combat situations, enemies often tried to isolate their targets before attempting more aggressive actions that they didn't want observed by potential allies or authorities. "What a thoughtful idea," Vivian agreed quickly, clearly understanding Priscilla's strategy. The ladies' lounge would be perfect for a more intimate discussion about appropriate behavior and expectations. Sarah felt her tactical awareness shift into high alert. The ladies' lounge was smaller, more isolated, with fewer potential witnesses and limited escape routes. It was also a space where the social dynamics would be even more skewed in favor of her antagonists, who would feel completely comfortable asserting their dominance in what they considered their natural territory. "Oh yes," Margot chimed in enthusiastically, "much more appropriate for addressing these kinds of delicate matters. We wouldn't want to embarrass anyone unnecessarily in such a public setting." The false concern in her voice was transparently malicious. Sarah understood that they were offering her a choice that wasn't really a choice: submit to being moved to a more vulnerable position, or refuse and be accused of causing a scene in front of the entire gala. It was a classic manipulative tactic, creating the illusion of option while actually constraining the target's ability to resist. Bradley stepped closer, his role in the manipulation becoming clearer as he positioned himself to physically encourage Sarah's compliance with their suggestion. "Come on," he said with mock friendliness. "Let's not make this harder than it needs to be. Just a quick private chat to clear up any confusion about boundaries." The threat underlying his words was unmistakable. Sarah could see in his alcohol-clouded eyes the same reckless confidence that had probably been present the night he'd climbed behind the wheel of his Ferrari and destroyed her family. He was someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation and the assumption that his wealth and connections would protect him from consequences. Sarah found herself facing a tactical decision that required balancing multiple factors. Refusing to move would likely result in a more public confrontation that could jeopardize her position in the Whitmore household and potentially expose her true identity. Complying would put her in a more vulnerable position but might provide opportunities to deal with the situation more decisively without witnesses. "If you think it would be more appropriate," Sarah replied calmly, her tone suggesting agreement while her mind rapidly assessed the tactical implications of the proposed change in venue. She'd operated in hostile territories where cooperation with enemy demands was sometimes the best strategy for creating opportunities to turn the table. The ladies' lounge was accessed through a corridor lined with oil paintings of Whitmore family ancestors, stern-faced men and elegantly dressed women who seemed to observe the procession with disapproving eyes. Sarah noted the layout automatically: marble floors that would muffle footsteps but amplify voices, ornate mirrors that could be used to monitor multiple angles, and heavy wooden doors that would provide both privacy and sound insulation. The lounge itself was a testament to old-money elegance, with velvet upholstered chairs arranged around a central seating area, antique vanity tables with silver-framed mirrors, and fresh orchids that filled the air with their delicate fragrance. It was designed as a sanctuary where wealthy women could retreat for private conversations away from the mixed company of the main ballroom. Priscilla moved immediately to the center of the room, her posture suggesting ownership of the space as she positioned herself where she could control the conversation's flow. Margot and Vivian flanked the entrance, effectively blocking Sarah's most direct escape route, while Bradley positioned himself near the large window that overlooked the estate's garden. "Now then," Priscilla began, her voice taking on a more authoritative tone now that they were away from potential witnesses, "I think we need to have a frank discussion about your behavior this evening. There seems to be some confusion about your role here and what's appropriate for someone in your position." Sarah could feel the shift in dynamics immediately. Without the restraining presence of other guests, her antagonists felt free to drop the pretense of politeness that had characterized their public performance. This was where the real confrontation would begin, where their true intentions would be revealed without the need to maintain appearances for their social peers. The room's isolation also meant that whatever happened here would be witnessed only by the participants themselves. For people accustomed to operating within social hierarchies where reputation and appearance mattered more than truth, this privacy created opportunities for more aggressive behavior that they would never risk in public settings. Sarah positioned herself near one of the antique vanity tables, her back to the wall and her eyes on all four of her opponents. The arrangement gave her a clear view of all potential threats while limiting the angles from which they could approach her. It was a defensive position, but one that also provided excellent observation points for assessing their intentions and capability. What her antagonists didn't realize was that by isolating her from witnesses, they had also isolated themselves from the social constraints that had been protecting them. In this private space with no cameras or observers to worry about, Sarah would be free to respond to their aggression with methods that her military training had taught her were sometimes necessary when dealing with hostile forces. The elegant ladies' lounge was about to become a battlefield where privilege and assumption would face off against training and experience, and where the outcome would be determined not by social status but by who was better prepared for actual conflict. The privacy of the ladies' lounge seemed to unleash something darker in Priscilla's demeanor. Without the need to maintain appearances for their social peers, her mask of polite condescension dropped to reveal the cold calculation that lay beneath. She moved with the confidence of someone who had orchestrated many such private confrontations, each one designed to break down targets who threatened her carefully maintained position in the social hierarchy. "Let me be perfectly clear about something," Priscilla began, her voice taking on the sharp edge of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Your little performance out there was completely inappropriate. Walking around this gala as if you belong here, mingling with guests who have spent decades building their reputations and relationships. It's not just presumptuous, it's insulting to everyone who has earned their place in this community." Sarah remained silent, recognizing that Priscilla was building towards something more vicious than the relatively restrained attacks she'd delivered in public. This was the real assault, the one that would reveal the true depth of these people's entitlement and cruelty. Do you have any idea? Vivian added, stepping closer with the precision of someone joining a coordinated attack. How much effort goes into maintaining the standards of events like this? The careful guest curation, the attention to protocol, the respect for social boundaries that people like you seem to think don't apply to them. The accusation was clear. They were positioning Sarah as someone who had violated sacred social rules through her mere presence, as if her existence in their space was itself an act of aggression against the natural order they believed they represent. Bradley moved closer to the conversation, his alcohol-fueled confidence making him bolder in his contributions to the verbal assault. You know what I think happened here? He said, his words slightly slurred but his intent, unmistakably hostile. I think someone got ideas above their station. Maybe spending time around all this wealth made you forget that you're just the help. Maybe you started thinking you deserve to be treated like an actual person instead of the domestic employee you are. Sarah felt a cold rage building in her chest as she listened to the man who had killed her family lecture her about knowing her place. The irony was almost overwhelming. Here was someone whose reckless behavior had destroyed innocent lives, protected from consequences by the same wealth and privilege he was using to attack her, completely oblivious to the fact that he was speaking to one of his victims. The problem with people from your background, Margot continued, her voice dripping with the kind of casual cruelty that came from a lifetime of believing in her own superiority, is that you don't understand how charity works. When wealthy families employ people like you, when they include you in their lives, it's an act of generosity. But generosity has limits, and those limits get tested when employees start acting like their family instead of hired help. The attack was becoming more personal, more direct in its assault on Sarah's dignity and humanity. These people weren't just asserting their social dominance, they were attempting to psychologically destroy someone they perceived as a threat to their established order. I've seen this before, Priscilla said with the air of someone sharing hard-won wisdom. Domestic employees who get too comfortable, who start thinking their proximity to wealth makes them somehow special. It usually ends badly: terminated employment, negative references, difficulty finding work in respectable households. The service industry is smaller than people think, and word travels quickly about staff who don't know their place. The threat was explicit now: comply with their demands for submission, or face professional and financial ruin. For someone who actually depended on domestic employment for survival, such threats would have been devastating. What they didn't realize was that they were threatening someone who had commanded Marines in combat, someone whose actual qualifications far exceeded anything their privileged backgrounds had provided. Maybe we should discuss this with Victoria, Bradley suggested with mock helpfulness. I'm sure she'd be very interested to know how her nanny has been conducting herself tonight, especially if there are concerns about appropriate boundaries and professional behavior. Sarah recognized the escalation in their threat. They were no longer content with private humiliation. They were now threatening to destroy her employment and potentially expose her carefully maintained cover. What they didn't understand was that their threats were revealing far more about their own vulnerabilities than about her. The thing about people who don't belong, Vivian added with clinical precision, is that they always reveal themselves eventually. Tonight, for instance, your behavior, your assumption that you could mingle freely with guests, your failure to maintain appropriate deference, it all demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of your role here. The attacks were becoming more systematic, more coordinated, each person contributing a different element to what was clearly intended as complete psychological destruction. Sarah could see the pattern clearly. They were working together to break down her composure, to force her into either submission or an emotional breakdown that would justify whatever further actions they had planned. Do you understand what we're trying to tell you? Priscilla asked with false patience, her tone suggesting that Sarah's continued composure was evidence of intellectual deficiency rather than self-control. This isn't your world, these aren't your people. You're here because Victoria Whitmore was kind enough to employ you, but that kindness has limits, and you've been testing those limits all evening. Sarah remained perfectly still, her military training allowing her to absorb the verbal assault without giving these amateur psychological warriors the satisfaction of a visible reaction. What they didn't realize was that every word they spoke was being catalogued and analyzed, their motivations and weaknesses becoming clearer with each cruel revelation. These people had no idea that they were conducting their psychological warfare against someone who had been trained by professionals to resist far more sophisticated attacks, someone whose actual background and capabilities made their assumptions about power and vulnerability laughably wrong. The verbal assault had reached its crescendo, but Sarah's continued composure seemed to frustrate her attackers rather than satisfy them. Priscilla's face had taken on the flushed appearance of someone whose preferred methods of dominance were proving ineffective, and Sarah could see the dangerous shift in her body language that suggested the escalation was about to become physical. "I don't think you're grasping the seriousness of this situation," Priscilla said, stepping forward until she was close enough that Sarah could count the diamonds in her tennis bracelet. "Perhaps you need a more direct explanation of your position here." Without warning, Priscilla reached out and grasped Sarah's wrist, her grip firm enough to leave marks on someone with more delicate skin. The contact was ostensibly meant to emphasize her point, but Sarah recognized it immediately as a dominance display designed to demonstrate physical control over someone she considered inferior. "When I'm speaking to you," Priscilla continued, her fingers tightening around Sarah's wrist, "I expect your full attention. Not this blank, insolent staring that suggests you think you're somehow above this conversation." Sarah felt the familiar surge of combat readiness that came when hostile forces made the transition from verbal to physical aggression. In Afghanistan, enemy contact often began with seemingly minor physical provocations designed to test responses and gauge capability. Priscilla had just crossed a line that transformed this from social harassment into something that Sarah's military training classified as a direct threat. Margot moved to Sarah's other side, her hand settling on Sarah's shoulder with the casual possessiveness of someone who believed she had the right to touch anyone she considered beneath her social station. "You really should listen when Priscilla is trying to help you understand proper behavior," she said, her fingers pressing down with enough force to suggest ownership rather than friendly contact. The coordination was deliberate. By positioning themselves on either side of Sarah and maintaining physical contact, they were attempting to establish complete control over her movement and response. It was a classic intimidation technique, though these amateur practitioners had no idea they were employing it against someone who had been trained to recognize and counter such tactics. Bradley approached from behind, his movement calculated to complete their physical encirclement of their target. "Maybe she needs a more practical demonstration of hierarchy," he suggested, his voice carrying the cruel amusement of someone who enjoyed watching others being humiliated and controlled. Sarah could feel his presence behind her close enough that his alcohol-tainted breath touched the back of her neck. The positioning was deliberately threatening, designed to make her feel trapped and helpless while demonstrating that her personal space meant nothing to people who considered themselves her social superior. "Stand up straight when we're addressing you," Vivian commanded, reaching out to adjust Sarah's posture as if she were arranging a mannequin. Her hands moved with the casual authority of someone who believed that other people's bodies were subject to her aesthetic preferences and social requirements. The physical manipulations were becoming more invasive, more degrading with each passing moment. Sarah found herself being touched, positioned, and controlled by people who clearly viewed her as an object rather than a person deserving of basic respect and bodily autonomy. "Your hair is quite disheveled," Priscilla observed with mock concern, reaching up to touch Sarah's carefully arranged ponytail. "Working people often have trouble maintaining proper grooming standards for formal events. Perhaps we should help you look more appropriate." The threat was clear. They were preparing to physically alter her appearance, to strip away whatever dignity she had managed to maintain through the evening's harassment. Sarah could feel fingers in her hair, hands on her clothing, bodies pressed close enough to restrict her movement and breathing. "This dress really doesn't fit properly, does it?" Margot commented, tugging at the fabric with the critical eye of someone evaluating a servant's uniform. "I suppose when you're shopping in thrift stores or borrowing from employers, proper fit becomes secondary to simply having something presentable to wear." The humiliation was becoming systematic and coordinated, each person contributing to a comprehensive assault on Sarah's dignity and autonomy. They were treating her like a doll to be dressed and arranged according to their preferences, completely disregarding her right to control her own body and appearance. Bradley's contribution was more directly threatening. His hand settled on the small of Sarah's back, the contact intimate and possessive in a way that crossed every boundary of appropriate behavior. "Relax," he whispered close to her ear, his words carrying undertones that made Sarah's combat instincts scream warnings about escalating danger. "We're just trying to help you understand your place," he continued, his hand moving in ways that were clearly intended to establish dominance through inappropriate sexual contact. "Some people need more direct instruction in proper behavior." Sarah felt something cold and deadly shift inside her chest as Bradley's hands became more invasive, more clearly crossing lines that transformed harassment into assault. The man who had killed her family was now attempting to sexually intimidate her, completely oblivious to the fact that he was targeting someone whose military training had included extensive preparation for exactly this type of situation. The physical violations were mounting rapidly, hands in her hair, fingers on her clothing, bodies pressed against her from multiple angles, and now clearly inappropriate sexual contact from the drunk driver who had destroyed everything she'd once held dear. The combination of personal history and present danger created a perfect storm of justified rage that Sarah's military discipline was barely containing. What these privileged predators didn't realize was that their physical escalation had just activated protocols that Sarah had learned in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. They had transformed themselves from annoying social bullies into legitimate physical threats, and Sarah's training had very specific methods for dealing with people who crossed that particular line. The elegant ladies' lounge was about to become a place where these pampered socialites would learn the difference between picking on genuinely helpless victims and assaulting someone who had been professionally trained to respond to physical aggression with overwhelming force. The moment that would later be remembered as the point of no return came when Bradley's wandering hands found the small gold locket that Sarah wore around her neck, a piece of jewelry that her attackers had somehow missed during their earlier catalog of her costume accessories. The locket was simple and unadorned, the kind of modest piece that wealthy people might dismiss as worthless sentiment, but to Sarah it represented something far more sacred than anything in Priscilla's jewelry collection. "What's this little trinket?" Bradley asked with mock curiosity, his alcohol-clouded fingers fumbling with the delicate chain as he pulled the locket away from Sarah's chest to examine it more closely. "Some kind of religious medal? A good luck charm from your boyfriend?" Inside the locket were 2 photographs that Sarah had carried through 3 combat deployments. One showed her parents on their wedding day, young and radiant with the kind of genuine happiness that no amount of money could purchase, and the other was a picture of her sister Emma at age 5, gap-toothed and laughing as she held up a crayon drawing of their family. Sarah's voice was deadly quiet when she spoke. "Let go of that." It was the first time all evening that her carefully maintained composure had cracked, and the change in her tone was so dramatic that it momentarily stopped the physical harassment. For a brief instant, something in Sarah's voice penetrated even Bradley's alcohol-impaired consciousness, triggering primitive survival instincts that warned him he might have made a terrible mistake. But the moment of clarity passed quickly, overwhelmed by years of privileged entitlement and the assumption that his wealth and social position made him untouchable. Instead of releasing the locket, Bradley's grip tightened on the chain, his cruel smile widening as he realized he had finally found something that could break through Sarah's infuriating calm. "Oh, this is precious," he said, tugging the locket hard enough that the chain bit into Sarah's neck. "Let me guess. Dead relatives? Failed relationships? Some tragic backstory that's supposed to make us feel sorry for the poor little nanny?" Priscilla's eyes lit up with malicious interest as she sensed that Bradley had discovered a weakness they could explore. "How touching that you carry reminders of your humble origins. I suppose when you come from nothing, these little mementos become quite important." Sarah felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. Not anger or rage, but something colder and far more dangerous. The locket contained the only photographs she had of her family, images that had sustained her through the darkest moments of combat and helped her maintain connection to the people she'd lost. These pictures were literally irreplaceable, the last tangible links to a life that had been destroyed by the same reckless cruelty that Bradley was displaying now. "Give it back," Sarah said, her voice carrying a quality that made Vivian take an involuntary step backward. There was something in Sarah's eyes now that didn't belong in a charity gala, something that spoke of places where life and death decisions were made in split seconds, and where mercy was a luxury that couldn't always be afforded. But Bradley was too drunk and too accustomed to getting his way to recognize the warning signs that were obvious to anyone with combat experience. Instead of returning the locket, he held it up like a trophy, examining the photographs with the casual cruelty of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. "Well, well," he said, squinting at the tiny images. "Looks like we have some family photos here. How absolute quaint. Tell me, Sarah, are these the people who raised you to think you could just walk into our world and demand to be treated as an equal?" The violation was complete now, not just physical harassment or social humiliation, but a direct attack on the memory of the people who had loved her unconditionally and died because of this man's reckless choices. Sarah could feel her military training warring with emotions so powerful they threatened to overwhelm decades of professional discipline. "You know what I think?" Bradley continued, apparently oblivious to the fact that he was holding photographs of his own victim. "I think these dead people would be ashamed to see how their little girl turned out. Pretending to be something she's not, trying to climb above her station, forgetting the humble values they probably tried to teach her." The words hit Sarah like physical blows, each syllable a deliberate desecration of everything she held sacred. This was the man who had killed her family speaking about their values, their love, their memory, as if he had any right to judge people whose worth he couldn't begin to comprehend. Margot, sensing that they had found their target's breaking point, moved closer to add her own contribution to the assault. "Perhaps we should keep these little pictures," she suggested with calculated malice, "as a reminder of what happens when people forget their place. Consider it a learning experience." The threat to take the photographs, the last tangible connection she had to her murdered family, was the final violation that Sarah's military discipline could absorb. She had endured physical harassment, sexual assault, and psychological warfare with professional composure, but the moment these people threatened to steal the memory of her loved ones, every protocol that had kept her restrained throughout the evening was overwhelmed by a force that no amount of training could contain. Sarah's eyes shifted from the controlled alertness of a professional soldier to something far more primal and dangerous. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who understood violence, the change from someone exercising restraint to someone who had moved beyond the reach of mercy or negotiation. "Last chance," Sarah said quietly, her words carrying the weight of finality that combat veterans recognized as the moment when diplomacy ended and survival began. "Give me back the locket," and walk away. But Bradley, drunk on alcohol and privilege, made the choice that would haunt him for the rest of his considerably shortened social career. Instead of recognizing the warning for what it was, he laughed, a sound that would be the last expression of amusement he would make for a very long time. "Or what?" he sneered, tightening his grip on the chain until it threatened to break. "What exactly do you think you can do about it?" In that moment, Sarah Mitchell, decorated Marine veteran, Bronze Star recipient, and survivor of 3 combat deployments, made a decision that would transform a charity gala into something that Manhattan society would whisper about for decades to come. The air in the ladies' lounge seemed to crystallize as Sarah's demeanor underwent a transformation that was both subtle and terrifying. Years of military bearing that had been carefully hidden beneath the facade of a deferential employee suddenly became visible, and the 4 wealthy socialites found themselves facing someone who radiated a quiet authority that had nothing to do with money or social position. Sarah straightened to her full height, and suddenly the modest black dress that they had mocked seemed less like a servant's uniform, and more like the understated confidence of someone who had never needed expensive clothes to command respect. Her shoulders squared with the precise alignment of someone who had stood at attention before generals and foreign dignitaries, and her eyes held the steady focus of someone who had made life and death decisions in places where hesitation meant casualty report. "My name," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly through the ornate room with the projection techniques learned from addressing troops in combat zones, "is Captain Sarah Mitchell, United States Marine Corps. I served 3 tours of duty in Iraq, leading reconnaissance missions in Fallujah and Ramadi. I hold a Bronze Star for valor, a Purple Heart, and commendations for distinguished service under fire." The words fell into the perfumed air of the ladies' lounge like grenades detonating in a flower garden, Priscilla's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the sudden pallor that spread across her face as the implications of Sarah's revelation began to penetrate her alcohol-clouded consciousness. Margot took an involuntary step backward, her hand moving to her throat in a gesture of unconscious vulnerability. "The photographs you're holding," Sarah continued, her voice maintaining the calm precision of someone delivering a tactical briefing, "are of Staff Sergeant Jack Mitchell and his wife Mary along with their daughter Emma Mitchell, aged 30. They were killed 3 years ago by a drunk driver who was speeding through a residential neighborhood in his Ferrari while under the influence of alcohol and cocaine." Bradley's face went white as the blood drained from his features. The locket suddenly felt heavy in his hands as understanding began to penetrate the alcoholic haze that had insulated him from reality throughout the evening. He tried to speak, but no sound emerged from his throat as the full horror of what he had been doing crashed over him like a collapsing building. "That drunk driver," Sarah said, her eyes fixed on Bradley with the unwavering intensity of a sniper acquiring a target, "received 18 months in prison, of which he served 11 before being released for good behavior. His name was Bradley Hartwell, and he's standing in this room right now, holding photographs of the family he murdered while mocking their memory and threatening to steal the only images I have left of them." Vivian made a small choking sound, her hand flying to her mouth as she realized that she had been participating in the psychological torture of someone who had not only survived multiple combat deployments, but was also the victim of the very man who had been leading their harassment campaign. The elegant ladies' lounge suddenly felt like the scene of a crime rather than a sanctuary for polite conversation. "Furthermore," Sarah continued with relentless precision, "the child you've been discussing, Emma Whitmore, is my cousin. My father was Jackson Whitmore, the eldest son who was disowned for marrying a teacher instead of maintaining the family's social expectations. Which means that the woman you've been treating as hired help is actually a member of the family you've been trying to impress all evening." The revelation hit the room like a tactical nuclear strike. Priscilla's mouth opened and closed soundlessly as she processed the fact that she had spent the evening systematically humiliating someone who was not only a decorated war hero but also part of the Whitmore family tree. Margot swayed slightly, as if the marble floor had suddenly become unstable beneath her expensive shoes. Sarah took a step forward, and despite the fact that she was outnumbered 4-1, all 4 of her antagonists instinctively moved backward. There was something in her movement now that spoke of professional violence, of someone who had been trained to close distance with enemies and neutralize threats with extreme efficiency. "So here's what's going to happen," Sarah said, her voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who had commanded Marines in combat situations. "You're going to return my locket immediately. You're going to walk out of this room quietly and return to the gala. You're going to treat the remaining evening as if this conversation never happened, and you're never going to speak to me about me or in my presence ever again." Bradley's hands were shaking now as the full weight of his situation became clear. He was holding photographs of people he had killed while standing face to face with their surviving daughter, a woman who had been trained by the United States military to neutralize threats and who had every moral and legal justification to view him as an enemy combatant. "Because if you don't," Sarah continued, her tone remaining conversational despite the lethal implications of her words, "I'm going to do something that will make your previous legal troubles look like a minor inconvenience. I know exactly how to make people disappear without leaving evidence, how to cause injuries that look accidental, and how to destroy reputations so thoroughly that you'll never recover from the social fallout." The threat was delivered with the same professional calm that Sarah had once used to coordinate artillery strikes, and everyone in the room understood that they were hearing not empty bluster but a tactical assessment from someone with the training and experience to carry out every promised consequence. "This is your final warning," Sarah concluded, extending her hand with the expectation of immediate compliance. "Return my property, leave this room and never cross my path again, because the next time you try to hurt someone I care about, I won't be nearly as restrained as I've been tonight." The ladies' lounge had become a battlefield where privilege and assumption had encountered training and justified rage, and the outcome was no longer in doubt. The silence in the ladies' lounge stretched for what felt like an eternity, broken only by the sound of Bradley's trembling hands as he carefully placed the locket back around Sarah's neck. His movements were those of someone defusing an explosive device, terrified that any sudden motion might trigger consequences he was completely unprepared to face. "I didn't know," Bradley whispered, his voice barely audible as the full weight of his actions throughout the evening crashed down on him. "The accident," I never knew their names. I never thought about. That's the problem, Sarah said quietly, accepting the locket and checking to ensure the photographs were undamaged. You never thought about them as real people. They were just obstacles in your path, just like you assumed I was to. But every person you dismiss, every life you consider beneath your notice, has a story, has family, has value that has nothing to do with your bank account. Priscilla, who had built her entire identity around social dominance, found herself speechless for perhaps the first time in her adult life. The woman she had spent hours humiliating was not only her social equal but someone who had earned respect through actual sacrifice and service while she had inherited hers through birth lottery. The door to the ladies' lounge opened suddenly, and Victoria Whitmore entered with the confident stride of someone checking on her guests. She stopped short when she saw the tableau before her, 4 of her most prominent guests standing frozen like statues while her daughter's nanny stood in the center of the room with the bearing of a military officer. Is everything all right in here? Victoria asked, her social instincts detecting the tension immediately. Sarah, I was looking for you. Charles wanted to. Actually, Mrs. Whitmore, Sarah interrupted gently, there's something I need to tell you, something I should have shared when you first hired me. Victoria's eyebrows rose slightly, but her expression remained composed as Sarah reached into her purse and withdrew a small, worn photograph, the same image that Charles had shown during his presentation, but this copy was creased from years of being carried through combat zones. My father was Jackson Whitmore, Sarah said simply, your husband's older brother, the one who left the family 30 years ago. Victoria's composure cracked for the first time, her hand moving instinctively to her throat as she stared at the photograph. Jackson's daughter, she whispered. But that means Emma is. My cousin, Sarah confirmed, the only family I have left. I took this job not because I needed employment, but because I wanted to be close to the last connection I had to my father's bloodline. Emma doesn't know, and I never intended to tell her, but I couldn't bear the thought of her growing up without knowing that someone who shared her grandfather's eyes was watching over her. The revelation transformed everything in an instant. Priscilla and her companions found themselves witnesses to a family reunion that rendered their entire evening of harassment, not just cruel but tragically absurd. They had spent hours attempting to humiliate someone who was not only their social superior by birth, but their moral superior by every measure that actually mattered. My God, Victoria breathed, moving closer to study Sarah's features with new eyes. You have his eyes. Jackson's eyes. Charles always said, we've been looking for you for years. We hired private investigators after we learned about the accident. We wanted to find Jackson's family, to bring you home, but I was deployed, Sarah finished. And when I came back, I wasn't ready for family. I needed to find my own way first, to understand who I was outside of the military. Taking care of Emma was my way of staying connected while I figured out how to be a civilian again. Charles Whitmore appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion. His face went through a series of emotions as he processed the scene before him, confusion, recognition, and finally overwhelming joy as he realized that the quiet, capable woman who had been caring for his daughter was actually his long-lost niece. Sarah, he said, his voice thick with emotion, welcome home. The embrace that followed was witnessed by 4 people who had learned a devastating lesson about the dangers of assumption and the hollowness of inherited privilege. Priscilla, Margot, Vivian and Bradley stood frozen as they watched a family reunion that their cruelty had nearly prevented. There's something else you should know, Sarah said, looking directly at Bradley as she remained in her uncle's embrace. Mr. Hartwell was involved in my parents' accident. He was the driver. The temperature in the room seemed to drop by 20 degrees. Charles's expression shifted from joy to something far more dangerous as he processed the information. Victoria's face went pale as she realized that they had unknowingly invited their niece's family's killer to share their table. I think, Charles said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of pharmaceutical empire influence, that Mr. Hartwell should leave immediately. Security will escort him out, and he is permanently banned from any Whitmore family event. Additionally, I believe our legal department will want to review the circumstances of that case very carefully. Bradley's face crumpled as he realized that his social protection was evaporating in real time. The Hartwell family's influence was considerable, but the Whitmores controlled billions in pharmaceutical patents, and had connections that reached into every level of government and society. As security arrived to remove Bradley from the premises, Sarah turned to address Priscilla and her remaining companions. "I want you to understand something," she said calmly. "Tonight, you tried to destroy someone based on assumptions about their worth and background. You judged a book by its cover and found yourselves completely wrong about everything that mattered. I hope you'll remember this the next time you encounter someone who doesn't fit your expectations of who belongs in your world." The moral lesson was clear and devastating. True worth comes from character, service, and sacrifice, not from inherited wealth or social position. These women had spent their lives believing that their accidents of birth made them superior to others, only to discover that they had been tormenting someone whose actual accomplishments dwarfed anything they had ever achieved. 6 months later, Sarah Mitchell Whitmore stood at the podium of the same ballroom, now serving as the executive director of the Whitmore Foundation's Veteran Services Division. Her first initiative had been to establish a program, ensuring that no veteran would ever have to hide their service record to find employment, and that military experience would be properly valued by civilian employers. Emma Whitmore, now aware that her beloved nanny was actually her cousin and hero, sat in the front row with pride radiating from her 8-year-old face. The little girl had taken to introducing Sarah as "my cousin, the war hero," to anyone who would listen. Bradley Hartwell was serving a 5-year sentence for vehicular manslaughter after new evidence mysteriously surfaced in the case. Priscilla Ashworth had quietly resigned from several charity boards after her behavior at the gala became known throughout Manhattan society. The others had simply faded from prominence, learning too late that reputation built on cruelty was ultimately unsustainable. And in the quiet moments before sleep, Sarah would touch the locket around her neck and know that her parents would be proud, not of the wealth she had inherited, or the social position she could claim, but of the grace she had shown to people who had tried to break her spirit and the strength she had found to turn their hatred into a lesson about the true meaning of honor. The evening that had begun with whispers of "she's just the nanny," had ended with the understanding that the most important titles are the ones you earn through service, sacrifice, and the courage to stand up for what's right, even when you're standing alone.
You've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.